It was a beautiful Sunday morning, May the 18th of 1980, and volcanologist David Johnston was right about here on what is now called Johnston Ridge. Suddenly he radioed in, Vancouver, this is it," as he watched the mountain blow up in front of him.
The bulge that formed on the north flank of Mount St. Helens collapsed, and it created a huge landslide. It's actually the largest landslide in recorded history. It basically came down, crashed into Spirit Lake, pushed the water of Spirit Lake out and up into the adjacent peaks. About a 300-foot tall wave of water was displaced out of the lake and traveled about 800 feet up into the mountain. It basically washed up in there and washed back in. The bottom of the lake had been filled with this collapsing mountaintop, so the entire lake was lifted a couple hundred feet in the air. So the current bottom of the lake is above the former surface of the lake. The landslide was traveling fast enough that it went up and over Johnston Ridge and into the valley of South Coldwater Creek. Most of the landslide made a pretty untidy left turn and headed west following the path of least resistance down the North Fork of the Toutle River Valley and flowed about 14 miles downstream to about where that giant bridge, the Hofstede Bridge, is now. And that took about 10 minutes time for that whole thing to come to rest.
After the landslide, the full power of the mountain was unleashed.
The north flank of the mountain slides down, opens up that chamber, and basically you had this sideways release of tremendous pressure in this tremendous sideways explosion, what we call the lateral blast. And that thing was traveling supersonic at first, and over the up to 17 miles that it traveled from the volcano, it was going at an average speed of about 350 miles an hour. It was not just the blast of air, it was a blast of hot, glowing, fragmented rock.
It has been described as 500 atomic bombs, so you can imagine that. If you look at the first 6 miles, it's what we call the zone of complete destruction. There's nothing left. The trees that were there are gone, the earth is gone. It's blown to bare rock. Any vehicles or any people that were in that area have never been found.
And of course, as it tore the forest apart, in the first ridges closest to the volcano, Johnston Ridge included, it was powerful enough that it literally pulled the trees apart into pieces, and that blasted forest became part of the blast itself. Geologists call the area on Johnston Ridge the tree removal zone because the blast was literally picking the trees apart and fragmenting them, and all you'll see on Johnston Ridge today are the remnants of fragmented stumps.
The next 6 miles you have what we call the complete blowdown zone. So the wind was still 200 miles an hour and knocked over every tree standing.
It began to slow and began to be following the topography. It, of course, was carrying a lot of fragmented rock with it, so it had weight to it. It was ground hugging, and kind of like a roller coaster. It was going up and over the ridges, and so you see the kind of the patterns of the jackstrawed trees laying every which way like needles on a frozen compass, recording the direction of that blast.
Then there's another area that's 2 miles or 3 miles past that in what we call the heat-killed zone.
It was no longer traveling fast enough to knock the trees over, but it was still hot enough to kill them in a standing condition. So around the outer margins of the blast zone, there's a standing dead forest that kind of marks that last bit of where the blast was traveling along. But it wasn't the end of the eruption, because now the vent was open. He had a direct pipe from the surface down to the magma chamber. And so the mountain began erupting vertically, sending ash up to 12 miles high for about the next 9 hours. And that followed the prevailing wind direction to the northeast, and of course turned day to night in eastern Washington.
Even though the devastation was enormous, two things had become apparent about the eruption which kept many out of harm's way.
What ended up going across the valley that took out Spirit Lake had come west down the Toutle River Valley. I think it would have inundated Longview and Kelso, Castle Rock, Toutle. the loss of life would have been much, much greater. It was bad enough the way that it was.
There's been some estimates of approximately 300 people that would have been, including Weyerhaeuser employees and the contractors that we had out there, that would have been caught in this mess. None of them probably would have survived. It is very fortunate that it happened on Sunday. I would have been here.
When we return, scientists began to understand how the landscape changed forever